At 3:15 a.m. on March 13, 1964, a red Fiat parked at the Kew Gardens train station, setting in motion a sequence of events that would permanently alter American psychology. In 1964, New York City operated on a fractured communication grid long before the centralized 911 system existed. If you needed help in the middle of the night, you had to dial 0 for an operator or know the direct 7-digit number to your local police precinct. This decentralized network meant that emergency responses were heavily reliant on human interpretation and immediate proximity. A call to the operator did not guarantee a swift dispatch of patrol cars. The operator had to route the call, explain the situation to a precinct desk officer, and hope a unit was available in the specific sector. This fragile chain of communication formed the invisible architecture of safety in 1964, a system that was about to be tested in the most tragic way possible. The procedural timeline of that early morning reveals a chilling gap between the actual events and the official record. Winston Mosley, a 29-year-old machine operator, spotted his target and followed her car back to her neighborhood. He parked his white Corvair on a nearby street, turned off the headlights, and waited in the freezing shadows. The investigative timeline shows he then approached on foot, armed with a hunting knife, executing a methodical and unprovoked assault. The attack occurred in 2 distinct phases, separated by a crucial window of time. After the initial strike, a voice from an upper-floor window shouted down, interrupting the assault and causing Mosley to flee to his parked car. He sat in his vehicle for roughly 10 minutes, observing the quiet street. When no police sirens broke the silence and no officers arrived to secure the scene, he made the calculated decision to return and finish what he had started. The immediate aftermath left a stain on the middle-class neighborhood of Kew Gardens, Queens. This was a quiet, residential enclave where people moved to escape the jagged edges of the inner city. The brutal crime shattered the illusion of suburban safety, leaving a physical and psychological scar on Austin Street. The violent reality of the murder forced the residents of Queens to confront a terrifying vulnerability right on their own doorsteps. Soon, the local tragedy mutated into a sprawling national indictment of urban apathy. The narrative that emerged did not just condemn the killer, it condemned the entire borough of Queens. The community was suddenly thrust into an unwanted spotlight, transformed overnight from a peaceful neighborhood into a dark symbol of moral decay. The people living in those brick apartment buildings were branded as cold, indifferent spectators to a nightmare. A heavy blanket of shame and confusion fell over the residents who lived overlooking the alley. Neighbors who had known each other for years began to exchange suspicious glances in the hallways and on the sidewalks. The emotional toll was suffocating as families were hounded by reporters demanding to know why they had failed to act. A deep collective guilt took root, even among those who had slept soundly through the entire ordeal. This profound emotional burden was compounded by a deep sense of isolation. People felt trapped in a story they did not fully understand, judged by a public that had already decided their guilt. The residents of Queens were no longer seen as ordinary citizens. They were unwilling participants in a modern morality play. The sheer weight of this public shaming left lasting psychological wounds that lingered in the neighborhood for decades. But beneath the heavy layers of public outrage and sociological debate, a real person had been lost. Her name was Catherine Susan Genovese, though everyone simply called her Kitty. She was 28 years old, the eldest of 5 children, and a woman fiercely determined to carve out an independent life in the city. The sensationalized headlines quickly stripped away her humanity, reducing her to a mere prop in her own tragedy. To understand the true weight of what happened, the focus must shift back to Kitty herself. She was not a passive symbol, but a vibrant, hard-working manager at a sports bar in Hollis. She worked late hours, navigating the city at night with a quiet confidence. Reclaiming her story means looking past the myth of the silent witnesses and examining the very real, terrifying final moments of her journey home. The physical layout of her final destination played a critical role in how the events unfolded. The Kew Gardens Long Island Railroad Station sat adjacent to a winding Tudor-style commercial strip on Austin Street. Behind these storefronts lay a narrow, dimly lit alleyway that served as a rear entrance to the apartments above. This alley was a canyon of brick and asphalt, trapping sound and obscuring visibility from the main road. Shadows pooled heavily in the recessed doorways and stairwells at the back of the building. The street lights from Austin Street barely penetrated the gloom of the parking area where Kitty left her red Fiat. It was an environment designed for utility, not for safety, filled with blind corners and heavy wooden doors. This dark and closed corridor created a fatal bottleneck, trapping her in a space where escape was nearly impossible. 2 weeks after the murder, a new framework was constructed around the Genovese case, reshaping how the public consumed the news. The New York Times published a front-page article claiming that 38 witnesses had watched the murder and done nothing. This media framing established a powerful narrative system, prioritizing a shocking sociological hook over the messy, complex reality of the actual police reports. It created a rigid template for how urban crime would be reported and understood. This narrative system functioned by stripping away context and amplifying a single, horrifying angle. The number 38 became an unquestionable data point, repeated so often it hardened into historical fact. The press mechanism did not allow for nuance, ignoring the fact that the attack happened in 2 stages, mostly out of sight. The Genovese story became a self-sustaining media engine, generating endless commentary while moving further away from the documented truth. The investigative process behind that famous article reveals a deeply flawed methodology. The police commissioner, frustrated by a different, unrelated scandal, had casually mentioned the silent witnesses to a top editor during a lunch meeting. Reporters were then dispatched with a specific mandate to find evidence supporting this predetermined angle. They knocked on doors and conducted brief, leading interviews, actively seeking quotes that fit the narrative of total indifference. The actual police records from the precinct told a vastly different procedural story. Detectives had interviewed dozens of people, but only a handful had seen any part of the attack, and most saw only brief, confusing fragments. Crucially, the record showed that at least 2 people did call the police, and another neighbor rushed downstairs to hold Kitty in her final moments. The journalistic procedure actively ignored these facts, burying the truth to preserve the impact of the headline. The immediate consequence of this distorted reporting was the rapid birth of the bystander effect. Psychologists quickly seized upon the Genovese article, using it as the foundational case study for a brand new field of research. They designed laboratory experiments to prove that the presence of others inherently diffuses personal responsibility. The tragic death of a young woman was permanently transformed into a sterile academic concept taught in every introductory psychology class in the world. This academic consequence solidified a lasting myth that completely overshadowed the actual crime. The bystander effect became a cultural shorthand, a way to explain away the perceived coldness of modern society. By focusing entirely on the supposed inaction of the neighbors, the public consciousness largely forgot about Winston Moseley, the man actually responsible for the violence. The myth became so powerful that it dictated public policy, influenced the creation of the modern emergency dispatch system, and buried the truth for nearly 40 years. For the Genovese family, this widely accepted narrative inflicted a deep secondary wound. They grieved the brutal loss of Kitty, but also the public branding of her death as a profound human failure. The Kew Gardens residents carried an unearned shame for decades, labeled globally as heartless cowards. Sophia Farrar, the neighbor who rushed out to hold Kitty in the hallway, lived with the reality that her bravery was erased. The media narrative required apathy, so genuine compassion was ignored. This relentless judgment created lasting trauma, proving that compelling stories easily destroy complex truths. As years passed, the raw pain of the neighborhood faded, but the psychological concept born from it grew stronger. The story of the silent witnesses detached itself completely from the real streets of Queens. It morphed into an undeniable social law, used to explain massive institutional failures. This shift moved the focus away from a violent killer and placed blame on everyday society. The bystander effect became the default lens for viewing urban life. It was no longer just an academic theory, it became a widely accepted truth about human nature in crowded cities. The urban landscape of the late 20th century was heavily colored by this framework. News broadcasts referenced the dangers of city apathy, painting neighborhoods as cold environments where residents always looked the other way. This created an atmosphere of deep social mistrust on every street corner. Inside city halls, this pervasive atmosphere forced a massive shift in how public emergencies were handled. The perceived failure of the Queens residents highlighted the chaotic nature of calling for help in 1964. The civic environment was ripe for a centralized solution to manage public fear. This urgent need directly accelerated the creation of the National 911 emergency system. By 1968, the first universal emergency number was implemented. The system was designed to bypass the confusion of dialing a local operator, routing all urgent calls to a dedicated dispatch center. The 911 system revolutionized public safety, serving as the most tangible legacy of the tragedy. Yet this monumental infrastructure was heavily driven by a journalistic exaggeration. It solved a real problem of emergency response, though the specific story of complete neighborhood silence was fundamentally untrue. For decades, the Genovese family navigated an agonizing reality. They were forced to watch Kitty become a textbook example of urban apathy, rather than a real person who was deeply mourned. Her brother, Bill Genovese, spent years tracking down the actual police records and court transcripts to uncover what really happened that night. Through his meticulous search, the family finally reclaimed the facts of her final moments. He found the sworn testimony proving that his sister did not die abandoned on a cold sidewalk. Instead, she passed away in the arms of her neighbor, Sophia Farrar, who had rushed out of her apartment to comfort her. The story of the 38 silent witnesses was a myth built on a brief, inaccurate police quote. But the image of a neighbor holding Kitty in that Queens hallway remains a quiet, enduring truth, replacing a legacy of indifference with a final act of profound human connection. Subscribe for a new story every week.